What if civilization hasn't been steadily climbing upward for the last 10,000 years? What if it's been starting over again and again, each time forgetting almost everything that came before? What if the ruins scattered across every continent aren't monuments to one great human journey, but tombstones marking where previous journeys ended? In museum basements around the world, clay tablets still hold lists of kings who ruled for thousands of years. Ice cores still preserve signatures of catastrophes that erased entire populations. Oral traditions still carry warnings encoded in flood myths that span every culture on Earth. The message was urgent when they carved it. Now it waits in silence, patient as stone. Picture yourself standing in the British Museum on a quiet winter evening, when most visitors have gone home and the galleries have fallen into that particular silence that only old buildings know. That hush that seems to carry the weight of everything contained within these walls. You have wandered through rooms filled with Egyptian sarcophagi and Greek marbles and Roman bronzes, past cases of medieval manuscripts and Renaissance paintings, until you find yourself in the Mesopotamian collection on the upper floors, where fewer tourists venture and where the lighting is dimmer and where the objects on display seem somehow older than old. Somehow more alien than anything else in this vast repository of human memory. In a climate-controlled case near the corner of the gallery rests a small clay prism, about 8 inches tall, 4-sided, covered entirely in tiny wedge-shaped marks that look almost like bird tracks pressed into mud. The label identifies it as the Weld Blundle prism, dated to approximately 1800 BCE, and describes it as a Sumerian king list recording the rulers of ancient Mesopotamia. Most visitors glance at it for perhaps 3 seconds before moving on to more visually impressive artifacts, to golden jewelry or carved reliefs or painted pottery. But if you lean close to the glass, if you let your eyes trace those ancient impressions, if you begin to understand what those marks actually say, something shifts in your understanding of history itself. This unassuming clay object contains what might be the most disturbing historical document ever discovered. A chronicle that mainstream scholarship cannot fully explain, and that most academics prefer not to discuss in detail because its implications are too strange, too unsettling, too far outside the comfortable boundaries of what we believe we know about human civilization and how long it has existed, and what came before the beginning we think we remember. The prism lists kings. That much is straightforward. It records the rulers who governed the cities of ancient Sumer in what is now southern Iraq, naming them one after another, noting how long each one reigned, tracking the passage of kingship from city to city as power shifted across the centuries. This is exactly the kind of administrative record we expect from ancient civilizations. The bureaucratic impulse to document succession and legitimacy, to create an unbroken chain linking present rulers to the authority of the past. But the numbers are where everything falls apart. The first king named on the list is Alulim of Eridu, and according to the text, he ruled for 28,800 years. Not months, not seasons, years. The second king, Al-Aljar, ruled for 36,000 years. The numbers continue in this impossible vein through 8 kings, whose combined reigns total 241,200 years, nearly 250,000 years of recorded kingship before a single catastrophic event that the text describes with haunting simplicity. Then the flood swept over. After the flood swept over, the list continues. Kingship descended from heaven once more. The kingship was in Kish. And here something strange happens. The post-flood kings still reign for impossibly long periods by our standards, but the numbers have dropped dramatically. The first king after the flood, Jushur, ruled for 1,200 years. Still impossible, yes, but a fraction of the antediluvian reigns. As we continue through more dynasties, the numbers keep declining. 900 years, 600 years, 400 years. By the time we reach kings whose existence we can verify through other archaeological evidence, whose names appear on inscriptions we have excavated and dated, the reign lengths have become almost normal. Gilgamesh, that legendary hero king of Uruk, who may have been an actual historical figure, is listed as reigning for 126 years. Still long, perhaps inflated by legend, but no longer in the realm of cosmic timescales. And by the dynasties of the early 2nd millennium BCE, the reigns are entirely ordinary. 20 years, 35 years, 11 years, human lifespans, human history. As if the document is recording a slow descent from something superhuman to something recognizably mortal, from ages measured in cosmic cycles to ages measured in heartbeats. Mainstream scholars have explanations for these numbers. They always do. The most common interpretation holds that the antediluvian reign lengths are purely mythological, symbolic numbers with no historical basis whatsoever. The Sumerians used a sexagesimal mathematical system, base 60 rather than our base 10, which gives us 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. Many of the reign lengths in the king list are multiples of 60 or of 3,600, which the Sumerians called Asar. The numbers were chosen for their mathematical elegance, this interpretation suggests, not for their historical accuracy. They represent the sacred, the cosmic, the divine nature of kingship before the flood, not actual chronological time. This explanation is neat, it is rational, it might even be partially true. But it does not quite account for the pattern. Why would scribes recording purely symbolic mythology choose numbers that progressively decline in such a specific way? Why not simply say the first kings lived forever, or ruled for uncountable ages, or existed outside of time altogether? Why give precise figures that shrink across the document in what looks remarkably like a systematic pattern of diminishment? And why does this exact pattern appear in another ancient tradition that supposedly developed entirely independently, the lifespans of the biblical patriarchs? Adam lived 930 years according to Genesis. His son Seth lived 912 years. Methuselah, the longest lived, reached 969 years. Noah lived 950 years. Then came the flood, and after the flood, lifespans begin to decline. Abraham lived 175 years. Moses lived 120 years. By the time of King David, lifespans had normalized to what we recognize as human. Two entirely different textual traditions, Sumerian and Hebrew, separated by centuries of transmission and translation, both preserving the same basic pattern. Long lives before a great flood, shorter lives after. Progressive decline toward normal human mortality. Coincidence seems insufficient to explain this convergence. Something else is being remembered, something encoded in the only format that survives catastrophe. Story, pattern, the shape of change across time. Now imagine yourself as a scribe in ancient Nippur around 1900 BCE. You are perhaps 14 years old, an apprentice in the tablet house where young men learn the sacred art of writing. Your fingers are stained with the black ink used for practice on broken pottery shards. You have spent years memorizing signs, learning to press your stylus into wet clay at precisely the correct angle to create the wedge-shaped impressions of cuneiform. And today, your master has assigned you a sacred task. You are to copy the king list, that ancient chronicle that every scribe must preserve exactly, without variation, without error. Your master sits cross-legged on a reed mat, a fresh tablet of wet clay before him. You watch his stylus move with practiced grace, each sign emerging perfectly formed. And you wonder, as young people have always wondered, what these impossible numbers actually mean. "Why do you hesitate?" your master asks without looking up. "Because I do not understand," you admit, knowing that students may ask questions when the master is in good humor. The first kings. How could they have ruled for so many thousands of years? Your master does not pause in his work. "Because time was different then," he says. "Or because we measure it differently now. Or because those were not kings as we understand kings, but something else. Ages, perhaps. Eras. The length of a dynasty rather than a single life. Or because the gods walked among men in those days and shared their breath with mortal rulers." 4 different answers, all true, none complete. He finishes a line and looks at you with eyes that have seen many students struggle with this same question. "The numbers are sacred," he says. "We preserve them because those who came before us preserved them. What they mean changes with each generation that reads them. But the numbers themselves must not change. Do you understand?" You nod, though you do not. Not fully, not yet. Perhaps no one fully understands anymore. Perhaps understanding was lost long ago, in the flood itself. And what remains is only the echo, the shape of something that once held meaning, preserved faithfully by generation after generation of scribes who copied what they could no longer fully decode, trusting that the act of preservation mattered even when comprehension had failed. The clay prism you saw in the museum is one of approximately 20 copies of the Sumerian king list that have survived. They were excavated from various sites across Iraq over the past century and a half, and they all tell essentially the same story with minor variations. Some copies include additional kings, some record slightly different reign lengths, but the pattern holds across all of them. Long reigns before the flood, shorter reigns after, progressive decline toward normalcy. This consistency suggests that the scribes were copying from earlier sources, that the list had already been codified before any of the surviving versions were created, that it traces back through layer after layer of transmission to some original document or oral tradition that we no longer possess. How far back does it go? When was the first version composed? What did it mean to those who first recorded it before millennia of copying introduced the possibility of error or misunderstanding? These questions have no definitive answers. The archaeological record reaches only so far before it dissolves into darkness. But here is what we do know. The Sumerians, who composed this list, appeared in southern Mesopotamia around 4500 BCE. They built what we consider the first cities: Eridu, Uruk, Ur, Lagash, Nippur. They invented the wheel. They developed complex irrigation systems that turned harsh desert into fertile farmland. They created the first known system of writing, those wedge-shaped cuneiform impressions that would be used across the Near East for 3,000 years. They gave us the concept of time divided into hours, minutes, and seconds. As they developed mathematics sophisticated enough for complex accounting, geometry, early algebra. By every archaeological measure, they were the beginning of civilization as we understand it. But they themselves claimed they were not the beginning. In the opening lines of the King List, the text states simply, "After kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. Not kingship began. Not kingship was created. It descended. It came from somewhere else, somewhere higher." As if civilization was not invented but received. As if the Sumerians understood themselves as inheritors rather than originators, as the recipients of knowledge that predated them. Eridu, the oldest city in Sumer, perhaps the oldest city on Earth. When archaeologists excavated its ruins at Tel Abu Shahrain in southern Iraq, beginning in the late 1940s, they found something remarkable. Layer upon layer of temples, 17 in total, each built directly on top of the ruins of the one before, stretching back to approximately 5,400 BCE. The earliest temple was a simple structure, a small mud brick building with an altar and an offering table. Each subsequent temple was larger, more elaborate, more sophisticated, but all maintained the same basic orientation, the same sacred geometry, the same relationship to the cardinal directions. Generation after generation, century after century, the people of Eridu tore down what their ancestors had built and rebuilt it bigger, grander, but always in the same place, always following the same invisible blueprint. Why? What made this particular spot so sacred that it commanded such devotion across 3,000 years of continuous occupation? The Sumerians had an answer. Eridu was the first city. It was the place where kingship descended from heaven. It was the home of Enki, the god of wisdom and fresh water, who lived in the Abzu, the primordial freshwater ocean believed to exist beneath the earth. Before Eridu, according to Sumerian belief, there was only the Abzu and the gods who dwelt within it. Then Eridu was founded and civilization began. This is mythology, yes, but mythology that corresponds to archaeological reality. Eridu is, as far as we can determine, among the oldest continuously occupied urban sites in the world. The Sumerians were right about that much. But beneath the oldest temple, beneath the foundations of what the Sumerians themselves considered the beginning, our archaeologists found something else. A layer of clean silt, river sediment, the unmistakable signature of a massive flood. And beneath the flood layer, more evidence of human occupation, older pottery, different styles, people who lived there before the waters came, before the temple was built, before the history the Sumerians recorded began. The British archaeologist Leonard Woolley found similar flood deposits at multiple sites across Mesopotamia during his excavations in the 1920s and 1930s. At Ur, which he excavated extensively, he uncovered a stratum of water-laid clay nearly 10 feet thick, separating older occupation layers from newer ones. At Uruk, at Kish, at Shurupak, the same pattern appeared. Not everywhere, the flooding was not universal, but at enough sites to suggest a regional catastrophe of significant magnitude. Something happened around 2900 BCE, give or take a few centuries depending on which site you examine. A flood. Perhaps the flood the king list mentions. Now, perhaps the flood that Noah survived according to later Hebrew tradition, which almost certainly borrowed from Mesopotamian sources. Perhaps the flood that appears in flood myths from cultures around the world, from India to Greece to China to the Americas. Over 500 documented flood narratives collected by anthropologists, all describing essentially the same thing. A world destroyed by water, a handful of survivors, the beginning of a new age. For centuries, and Western scholars assumed the biblical flood was the original, and all other flood myths were either derivative or independent inventions inspired by local flooding events. The discovery of the Sumerian flood narratives in the 19th century overturned this assumption. The Mesopotamian accounts were older, more detailed, and clearly the source material for the biblical version. The parallels were too specific to be coincidental. The dimensions of the boat, the sending out of birds to find land, the sacrifice offered after survival, the covenant established between survivor and divine power. But if the Mesopotamian flood story predates the biblical version, what predates the Mesopotamian version? Where did the Sumerians get it from? And what actually happened? Let us turn now to something even stranger than impossible numbers pressed into ancient clay, something that should by all reasonable accounts be impossible. A pattern that appears across every inhabited continent, in cultures separated by vast oceans and thousands of years. Cultures that, according to everything we know about ancient travel and communication, had no way of sharing stories with one another. And yet, when you place their sacred narratives side by side, when you compare what the Sumerians wrote on clay tablets to what the Maya carved in stone, to what the Hindu sages chanted, to what Aboriginal Australians sang around fires in the outback, you find the same story. Not similar stories with surface resemblances that could be explained by universal human psychology, but the same narrative structure, the same sequence of events, the same specific details appearing again and again, as if every culture on Earth was trying to preserve the memory of something that actually happened, something so catastrophic and so transformative that it burned itself into human consciousness worldwide and refused to fade even across hundreds of generations of retelling. And the story they all tell is this. Once there was a world before this one, a world where things were different, where humans lived differently, knew more, perhaps lived longer, and then that world ended, destroyed by water, by flood, by the wrath of gods or the turning of cosmic cycles. And from the devastation, a handful of survivors emerged, often just one family, one righteous man warned by a sympathetic deity. And from those survivors, everything we know began again, smaller, younger, diminished, but alive. And if this sounds familiar, if it sounds like the story of Noah and his ark that you learned as a child, that is because the story of Noah is just one version of a narrative that predates the Bible by at least 1,000 years and appears in some form in over 500 distinct cultural traditions documented by anthropologists and folklorists. 500 separate accounts of a world drowned and reborn. The oldest written version we possess comes from ancient Mesopotamia, from those same clay tablets that gave us the impossible king list, and it is called the Atrahasis Epic, named after its human hero, whose name means exceedingly wise. When you read this text, when you follow the cuneiform symbols that scribes pressed into wet clay sometime around 1700 BCE, though the story itself is certainly much older, you encounter something that does not read like mythology at all. It reads like a technical document, like a project report, like the minutes of a committee meeting held in heaven to decide the fate of a species that had become problematic. And the problem, according to the text, was noise. Humanity had multiplied across the earth, had become numerous and loud, so loud that the chief god Enlil could not sleep. And this detail, which seems almost comical to modern ears, a god unable to sleep because of human noise, takes on different weight when you consider what noise might mean in this context. Not literal sound, perhaps, but activity, growth, expansion, a created species exceeding its designed parameters, becoming too successful, too independent, too numerous to control. Enlil tried various methods to reduce the human population. Plague first, which Enki, the clever god who had helped create humanity, undermined by teaching humans medicine. Then drought, which Enki undermined by teaching irrigation. Then famine, which Enki again circumvented. And finally, in frustration, Enlil proposed the ultimate solution, a flood that would wipe the earth clean, destroy every human, reset the experiment entirely. And the Council of Gods agreed, all of them sworn to secrecy, none of them permitted to warn the humans of what was coming. But Enki found a loophole. He did not speak directly to a human. Instead, he spoke to the wall of a reed hut, knowing that inside the hut a man named Atrahasis was listening. And what he said to that wall, what Atrahasis overheard, was instructions, precise instructions. Build a boat, make it watertight, bring aboard your family and representatives of all living things, and seal the door, wait. And Atrahasis did exactly this. He built the boat to specifications that the text provides with unusual precision. He loaded it with his family and with animals. He sealed the door, and then the flood came. The text describes it in terms that still carry terror across 4,000 years. The storm so violent that the gods themselves were frightened by what they had unleashed, cowering against the walls of heaven like dogs. The goddess Ishtar screaming that she had agreed to destroy her children. The world becoming water without boundary or horizon. And for 7 days and 7 nights, the flood raged while Atrahasis and his cargo floated on the destruction. And then it ended. The waters receded. The boat came to rest on a mountain, and Atrahasis emerged to find a world transformed, empty, silent, covered in mud and the bodies of the drowned. And his first act was to make a sacrifice, to burn meat and pour wine. Dan the gods, who had been starving without their human servants, to provide offerings gathered around the smoke like flies, the text says explicitly, like flies around the sweet smell. And there was a reckoning. Enlil furious that anyone had survived. Enki defending his action. And finally, a compromise. Humanity would be allowed to continue, allowed to rebuild, but with new limitations built in. Population controls hard-coded into the species. Infant mortality, barrenness in some bloodlines, celibate priesthoods that would remove potential parents from the breeding population. And these limitations, the text implies, are why we die young now, why we struggle and suffer, why the world after the flood is harder than the world before. If this story sounds familiar, if its structure seems to map perfectly onto the story of Noah that would be written in Hebrew perhaps 1,000 years later, That is because the parallels are not coincidental. The dimensions of the boats are similar. The sequence of releasing birds to test for dry land is identical. A dove that returns, a swallow that returns, a raven that does not return, signaling that dry land exists. The sacrifice after survival, the covenant established between divine and human, the promise of no more such destruction. These are not independent inventions. They are the same story transmitted across cultures and centuries, adapted, translated, theologized, but recognizably the same. And when George Smith first deciphered the flood tablets in the British Museum in 1872, when he realized what he was reading, the revelation shook Victorian England to its foundations because it meant the Bible was not the original. The Bible was the echo, the descendant, the later version of something that originated in the mud-brick cities of ancient Mesopotamia. But here is what should truly unsettle us. What should make us pause in our comfortable assumption that this is simply a case of cultural transmission, one story passing from Sumer to Babylon to Assyria to Israel and finally to us. The flood myth does not appear only in the ancient Near East. It appears everywhere, on every continent, in cultures that had no contact with Mesopotamia, no trade routes, no shared linguistic heritage, no way of passing stories across the vast distances involved. And the details are too specific, too consistent to be explained by appeals to universal human psychology or the fact that floods are a common natural experience. Yes, floods happen everywhere. Rivers overflow, tsunamis strike coasts. But the flood myths do not just say we had a bad flood once. They say the entire world was destroyed. Almost all humanity drowned. One family survived in a boat or on a mountain or by climbing a tall tree. And from that family, everyone now alive descends. That is not a story about local flooding. That is a story about apocalypse and survival and beginning again. In ancient India, the Matsya Purana tells of Manu, the first man who one day found a small fish in the water he was using for his morning ablutions. And the fish spoke to him, begged to be saved, promised to repay the kindness. And Manu, being compassionate, kept the fish, nurtured it as it grew larger and larger, impossibly large, until finally it revealed itself as Vishnu in avatar form and warned Manu that a great flood was coming that would destroy all life. And Vishnu instructed Manu to build a boat, to gather seeds of all plants and specimens of all animals, to bring his family aboard. And when the waters rose, Vishnu, in his fish form, towed the boat through the deluge until it came to rest on a mountain in the Himalayas. And from Manu, all subsequent humanity descends. The parallels to the Mesopotamian account are striking. The divine warning, the boat building, the collection of biological diversity, the flood, the mountain landing, the new beginning. But India and Mesopotamia had trade contact, had cultural exchange. So perhaps the story traveled legitimately along ancient commerce routes. Perhaps the Hindu version is a descendant of the Sumerian original. But how then do we explain the Maya? In the Popol Vuh, the sacred text of the Quiche Maya, written down in the 16th century, but preserving traditions far older, we find not just one flood, but a series of creation attempts. The gods trying repeatedly to make beings who would properly worship them. The first attempt using mud which dissolves. The second using wood which produces beings with no souls who cannot worship properly. And these wooden people are destroyed by a flood, by water falling from the sky and rising from the earth simultaneously, by their own domestic implements turning against them in rage, their grinding stones and cooking pots attacking them. And the survivors of this flood become the monkeys in the forest, failed prototypes persisting in degraded form. And only on the third attempt using corn, the sacred crop of Mesoamerica, did the gods succeed in creating humanity as we know it. Though even then, they had to limit human powers, cloud human vision, reduce human capability, because the first corn people were too perfect, too godlike, too threatening to divine supremacy. This pattern of creation, failure, flood, recreation, is not the same story as the Mesopotamian account. The details differ, the materials differ, but the structure is identical, the sequence is identical. Beings created, beings flawed or excessive, catastrophic destruction, usually involving water, survivors or new creation, the world beginning again with lessons learned. And the Maya had no contact with Mesopotamia, no trade routes across the Atlantic, no way of sharing stories with Sumerian scribes, and yet they told the same tale. In China, the Great Flood is central to the founding mythology of civilization itself. The story of Gun who tried to stop the floodwaters using a magical self-expanding soil, but failed and was executed for his failure. And his son Yu the Great, who succeeded through different methods, not trying to block the water, but channel it, spending 13 years digging canals and drainage systems, working so hard that the calluses wore off his legs, that he became crippled from the labor, but ultimately succeeding, controlling the waters, making the land habitable, founding the Xia dynasty, becoming one of the great culture heroes of Chinese tradition. While this story differs from the Western accounts in that it focuses on controlling and surviving the flood rather than escaping it in a boat, the underlying structure remains. Now, there was a time of destruction by water. There was heroic survival and intervention. There was a new beginning, and Chinese civilization, as they understand it, dates from after the flood, from the remaking of the world. In Greece, the poet Hesiod, writing in the 8th century BCE, told of Zeus deciding to destroy the degenerate humanity of the Bronze Age by flood. But Prometheus, the trickster titan who had already stolen fire for humans, warned his son Deucalion. And Deucalion built a chest, essentially a boat, and floated with his wife Pyrrha for 9 days and 9 nights, until the waters subsided and they landed on Mount Parnassus. And finding themselves alone in a world covered with mud and bodies, they prayed for guidance and were told to throw the bones of their mother over their shoulders. And understanding this to mean the stones of the earth, mother of all, they threw stones which transformed into humans, men from the stones Deucalion threw, women from those Pyrrha threw. And from these new humans, everyone now living descends. Again, the structure holds. Divine decision to destroy. One righteous family warned. Survival by floating on the flood. Mountain landing. New humanity arising after the waters recede. In Australia, where human habitation stretches back perhaps 60,000 years, far longer than anywhere else outside Africa, the Aboriginal peoples have flood narratives too. The Kai people of the north tell of a time when the sea suddenly rose, driven by fierce winds from the south, and swallowed the coastal lands where people had lived for generations. And the detail about wind direction, about the flood coming from a specific direction, suggests not myth, but memory. Actual observation of an actual event preserved across hundreds of generations. And geological evidence confirms that at the end of the last ice age, rising sea levels would have inundated vast stretches of the Australian coast, would have forced populations inland, it would have drowned settlements and sacred sites. And the Aboriginal oral traditions remember this, have preserved it for 12,000 years or more, not as myth, but as history transmitted through song and story. The examples multiply the more you look. In Scandinavia, the Norse told of Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods, when the world would be consumed by fire and water before being reborn. Of the great serpent Jormungandr rising from the sea, of almost all life perishing, but survivors emerging to repopulate a fresh green world. In Africa, among the Yoruba, a great flood sent by the supreme god Olorun wiped out an early humanity that had become wicked, with survivors preserving life and knowledge. In North America, the Ojibwe tell of Nanabojo, the trickster who floated on a log with various animals during a great flood, and afterward recreated the world by diving beneath the waters to bring up mud. In South America, the Inca preserved stories of Viracocha, the creator god who emerged from the waters of Lake Titicaca after a flood to create a new world and new humanity. We could continue through culture after culture. 500 documented flood narratives by scholarly count, possibly more that have never been collected or have been lost. And they all tell the same story, not similar stories that might arise independently from common human experience. The same story, the same structural sequence: divine warning, preparation, catastrophic inundation, survival of a small group, mountain or high ground landing, new beginning with survivors, or recreated humanity. The question hangs in the air unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. Why? Why would cultures spread across the globe with no contact with one another all tell this same tale? The rationalist explanation is that floods are universal human experience. Every river floods, every coast experiences storms, every population has experienced water-destroying homes and crops and lives. And so every culture developed flood mythology to process this trauma, to explain why the gods allow suffering, to provide narrative structure for disaster and recovery. This explanation might suffice if the stories were vague, if they simply said the waters rose and we survived. But they are not vague. They are specific. They share structural details that go far beyond the common experience of flooding. They share the sequence of birds sent out to test for land. They share the mountain landing. They share the sacrifice or offering made after survival. They share the covenant or promise established between divine and human. These are not universal features of flood experience. These are narrative choices, theological interpretations, specific story beats. Finding them repeated across cultures with no contact demands either an explanation involving transmission we do not understand, or an explanation far more unsettling: that they are all remembering the same thing. Consider the possibility that haunts the margins of academic archaeology, never spoken aloud in peer-reviewed journals, but whispered at conferences after the third drink. What if there was an actual event? A global or near-global catastrophe involving flooding that occurred within human memory, within the span that oral tradition could preserve. And what if every culture that survived that event passed down the memory generation after generation, adapting it to local languages and theological frameworks, but preserving the core, the structure, the specific details that seemed most important? And what if, after thousands of years of transmission, those memories became the flood myths we now possess? Are distinct in their surface details, but identical in their deep structure, because they all originate from the same experience, the same catastrophe, the same world ending and beginning again. But the flood myths are not the only pattern that repeats across cultures, not the only impossible convergence of narrative that demands explanation. Because alongside the flood myths, we find another structure equally widespread and equally specific. The concept of ages, of epochs, of cycles through which humanity and the cosmos pass, each one distinct from the others, each one ending in transition or catastrophe before the next begins. And in culture after culture, these ages decline. They begin in gold or truth or divine harmony and descend through increasingly degraded stages until reaching the current age, which is invariably the worst, the most violent, the most corrupt, the furthest from the original perfection. And this pattern of declining ages appears so consistently across cultures that it cannot be dismissed as coincidence, cannot be explained simply by the universal human tendency to romanticize the past. Something deeper is being encoded here, something that multiple unconnected civilizations felt was too important to forget. In India, the concept is formalized with mathematical precision into the doctrine of yugas, 4 great ages through which the cosmos cycles endlessly. Satya Yuga, the age of truth when Dharma, the cosmic law, stands on 4 legs, when humans live for thousands of years in harmony with divine order, when there is no disease, no hunger, no war, when the world is as the gods intended it to be. Then Treta Yuga, when Dharma stands on 3 legs, when human lifespan shortens, when the first conflicts arise, when the world begins its decline from perfection. Then Dwapara Yuga, when Dharma stands on 2 legs, when human lifespan shortens further, when violence becomes common, when spiritual knowledge begins to fade. And finally, Kali Yuga, the age of darkness when Dharma stands on 1 leg, when humans live at most 100 years, when war and famine and disease are constant companions, when spiritual truth is almost entirely forgotten. According to Hindu calculation, we are now in Kali Yuga, have been since 3102 BCE, and have another 400,000 years to endure before the cycle resets and Satya Yuga begins again. The proportions of these ages are precise, mathematically elegant. Satya Yuga, lasting 1,728,000 years. Treta Yuga, lasting 1,296,000 years. Dwapara Yuga, lasting 864,000 years. Kali Yuga, lasting 432,000 years. The ratio 4:3 to 2:1. Perfect proportional decline. In Greece, the poet Hesiod, writing around 700 BCE, long before Greek contact with India could have transmitted such ideas, described 5 ages of humanity in his work, Works and Days. The Golden Age, when humans lived like gods, free from toil and suffering, when the earth gave fruit without cultivation, when death came like gentle sleep after lives of immeasurable length. The Silver Age still blessed, but less so. Humans living long but foolish, worshipping the gods improperly, eventually destroyed by Zeus for their impiety. The Bronze Age, when humans were violent and warlike, obsessed with weapons, eventually destroying themselves through ceaseless conflict. the heroic age, the time of the great heroes of Greek myth, of Achilles and Heracles, and the warriors who fought at Troy, better than the Bronze Age, but doomed to end. And finally, the Iron Age, Hesiod's own time, the age of labor and suffering, of constant toil and early death, of children who do not honor their parents and humans who do not honor the gods. Hesiod explicitly laments that he was born in this worst of ages, wishes he had died before it or would be born after it. He looking backward with longing to the golden past and forward with hope to some distant renewal. The structure mirrors the Hindu yugas exactly: golden beginning, progressive decline, current age as nadir, implicit or explicit renewal to come. In Mesoamerica, the Aztecs counted 5 suns, 5 world ages, each presided over by a different divine force, each ending in catastrophic destruction. The first sun ended by jaguars who devoured the giant beings who lived then. The second sun ended by hurricanes so powerful they transformed humans into monkeys. The third sun ended by fiery rain that destroyed everything. The fourth sun ended by flood transforming the surviving humans into fish. And now we live in the fifth sun, which, according to Aztec belief, will end in earthquakes. The Aztec priests counted the days carefully, knowing that the fifth sun too would end, that the cycle would continue, and that destruction and recreation were the fundamental rhythm of cosmic time. The pattern is unmistakable. Culture after culture, on every continent, independent of any known transmission, developed the same understanding. Time moves in cycles. The cycles progress through stages. The stages decline from golden perfection to current degradation. The current age will end in catastrophe and renewal. And alongside this temporal model comes the parallel pattern of lifespan decline. In the Satya Yuga, humans lived for thousands of years. In the Kali Yuga, barely 100. In the Golden Age, humans lived like gods in lives of immeasurable length. In the Iron Age, they labor and die young. In the Sumerian king list, the antediluvian kings ruled for tens of thousands of years, while their post-flood successors ruled for progressively shorter periods. In the Bible, the patriarchs before the flood lived 900 years, while their descendants lived progressively shorter lives. This specific detail, the decline in lifespan across ages, cannot be explained by universal psychology. It is too specific, too consistent, appearing in cultures from India to Israel to Mesopotamia to Mesoamerica. It suggests that every one of these traditions was trying to preserve the same information. There was a time when humans lived differently, lived longer, and that time ended. And we are the diminished descendants of those who came before. And when we examine these myths more closely, when we look at what happens between the ages, at how one epoch transitions to the next, we find another pattern equally specific and equally impossible. The figure of the teacher, the civilizer, the being who appears after catastrophe to restart humanity, to give us the knowledge we need to rebuild, to bridge the gap between the old world and the new. These teacher figures appear in every culture that has flood myths and age myths, appearing as if on cue after the waters recede, carrying knowledge from before, establishing the foundations of civilization anew. In Sumer, they were called the Apkallu, the 7 sages, beings depicted in art as fishmen, with the upper body of a human and the lower body of a fish, or sometimes as humans wearing cloaks of fish skin. According to Sumerian tradition, These 7 sages appeared before the flood, served as advisors to the antediluvian kings. And then, after the flood, one of them emerged from the sea to teach humanity all the arts of civilization. The Babylonian priest Berossus, writing in Greek around 275 BCE, preserved a detailed account of this figure whom he called Oannes, describing him as a being with the body of a fish, but with a human head beneath the fish head and human feet beneath the fish tail. A creature that sounds less like mythology and more like someone wearing an elaborate diving suit or survival gear. Berossus says that Oannes rose from the sea each day to teach humanity writing, science, architecture, law, agriculture, everything needed to build civilization, and each night returned to the waters, never eating human food, speaking in human language, but not living as a human lived. This is not a simple God figure, not a divine being who creates through will. This is a teacher, a transmitter of practical knowledge, a bridge figure who carries information from one context to another. In Egypt, the god Thoth served this function, the ibis-headed deity who gave humanity writing, mathematics, medicine, astronomy, magic, all the arts that make civilization possible. While Thoth is certainly a god in the Egyptian pantheon, his function is distinctive. He does not create through divine fiat. He teaches. He gives knowledge. He enables humans to accomplish what they could not accomplish without instruction. Thus, the Egyptians believed that Thoth wrote 42 sacred books containing all essential knowledge, books that priests guarded carefully and studied constantly. Knowledge too important and too powerful for common people, preserved for those who could be trusted to use it wisely. In Mesoamerica, Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, served as civilizing deity, appearing in different forms across different cultures, as Kukulkan among the Maya, as Viracocha among the Inca, now always with the same function. The being who brought knowledge of agriculture, writing, astronomy, architecture, mathematics, the calendar. The being who established the foundations on which civilization rested. The legends say that Quetzalcoatl departed, sailed away across the sea, promising to return, leaving behind only the knowledge he had imparted and the structures he had helped to build. In China, the culture heroes play this same role. Fuxi, who taught humanity to fish and to write, and to divine the future through the 8 trigrams. Shennong, who taught agriculture and medicine. Huangdi, the Yellow Emperor who invented everything from writing to shipbuilding to the compass. While these figures are placed at the beginning of Chinese history rather than after a flood, they serve the same narrative function. They are the bridges between ignorance and knowledge, between nature and civilization, between what we could not do and what we learned to do through instruction. The pattern is consistent across cultures. After catastrophe comes teacher. After destruction comes reconstruction aided by beings who carry knowledge from before, who may or may not be human, who may or may not be divine, but who in every case serve as transmission mechanisms, as carriers of information across the gap that catastrophe creates. Who were these teachers? Where did they come from? How did they survive what destroyed everyone else? Why do cultures around the world preserve their memory in such strikingly similar forms? Now we leave the realm of mythology and enter something harder. Something carved into the bones of the earth itself. Because if the ancient stories are true, if civilizations have risen and fallen before ours, if humanity has been reset and rebooted multiple times across the deep millennia, then the evidence should be there. Written not in clay tablets or crumbling papyrus, but in the geological record, in ice cores drilled from Greenland glaciers, in sediment layers pulled from ocean floors, in the chemical signatures preserved in ancient soils. And here is where the story becomes uncomfortable for those who prefer their history neat and linear. Because the evidence is there. It has been accumulating for decades, and it points to something that mainstream scholarship has been reluctant to fully acknowledge. A catastrophic event that occurred precisely 12,800 years ago that nearly ended human civilization entirely and may have erased whatever came before. The Younger Dryas, named for a small Arctic flower called Dryas octopetala, whose pollen suddenly appears in sediment layers marking this period, indicating a rapid shift to much colder conditions. For decades, scientists believed they understood what caused it. The standard explanation goes something like this. As the last ice age was ending, massive ice sheets covering North America and Europe were melting, releasing enormous quantities of fresh water into the oceans. At some point, around 12,800 years ago, a catastrophic breach occurred. Glacial lakes containing more fresh water than all the current Great Lakes combined suddenly drained into the North Atlantic. This enormous pulse of fresh water, being less dense than salt water, formed a lid over the ocean surface, disrupting the thermohaline circulation, the great conveyor belt of currents that distributes heat around the planet. With the circulation system shut down, the northern hemisphere plunged back into near-glacial conditions. Temperatures dropping by as much as 15 degrees Celsius in some regions within a few decades, perhaps within a single human lifetime. This cold snap lasted for approximately 1,200 years before the climate suddenly snapped back to warm conditions, and the Holocene, our current geological epoch, began. It is a tidy explanation. It requires no exotic causes, no appeals to catastrophism. Just the ordinary processes of climate and ocean dynamics operating at unusual scales. And it may be partially true, part of the full picture. But beginning around 2007, a team of scientists led by nuclear physicist Richard Firestone, geologist Alan West, and about 24 researchers from various disciplines proposed something far more dramatic. They suggested that the Younger Dryas was triggered not merely by meltwater pulses, but by a cosmic impact. Fragments of a disintegrating comet striking the Earth and igniting continent-spanning wildfires while simultaneously destabilizing the ice sheets. The initial reaction from the scientific establishment was dismissive. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. But the Younger Dryas Impact Hypothesis team kept gathering data, kept publishing findings, kept accumulating evidence that became increasingly difficult to dismiss. And now, nearly 2 decades later, the debate continues, with new findings regularly appearing in peer-reviewed journals. In 2013, a research team analyzing sediment cores from a site in South Africa found something anomalous in a thin layer dating to precisely 12,800 years ago. A dramatic spike in platinum concentration. Platinum is extremely rare in Earth's crust, occurring naturally only in trace amounts. Now, you do not get sudden spikes in platinum from normal geological or climate processes. But platinum is relatively common in asteroids and comets. Its presence in a precisely dated geological layer is a calling card, a signature of extraterrestrial material. And the same platinum anomaly started appearing everywhere researchers looked: in Greenland ice cores, in sediment layers across North America, at sites throughout Europe, in multiple locations across Asia. The pattern is global. The timing is synchronous within the limits of radiocarbon dating precision. Then there are the nanodiamonds, microscopic diamonds invisible to the naked eye that only form under extreme combinations of pressure and temperature. Exactly the conditions that occur during high-velocity impacts or airbursts. Standard geological processes do not create nanodiamonds. You need shock, heat, and carbon all coming together in a moment of extraordinary violence. Nanodiamonds have been found in Greenland ice cores in layers dating to the Younger Dryas boundary. They have been found at dozens of terrestrial sites across 4 continents. Research published in 2024 documented the presence of shocked quartz in sediments from 3 separate sites on the eastern coast of North America, all dating precisely to the Younger Dryas boundary layer. The shocked quartz is quartz that has been subjected to such intense pressure that its crystal structure deforms at the molecular level. This is not something that happens through normal geological processes. The pressures required are found in only 2 scenarios: nuclear explosions or cosmic impacts. Put it all together: the platinum spikes, the shocked quartz, the melt glass spherules, the nanodiamonds. A picture emerges of devastation on a scale almost impossible to comprehend. Comet fragments, potentially thousands of them, from a massive progenitor comet that broke apart, screaming through Earth's atmosphere at hypersonic speeds. Airbursts of unimaginable power occurring across the Northern Hemisphere. Imagine the Tunguska event from 1908, when a meteor exploded in the air over Siberia, devastating an area of 800 square miles, flattening 80 million trees. Now imagine not one Tunguska, but thousands, scattered across North America, Europe, and Asia, all happening within days or weeks. The pressure waves would flatten forests for hundreds of miles. The heat would ignite everything combustible. A study published in the Journal of Geology estimated that approximately 30 million square miles of Earth's surface burned during this period. That is roughly 10% of the planet's total land biomass going up in flames. But the comet did not just bring fire and darkness. It brought water, tremendous amounts of water. The fragments impacted primarily in the Northern Hemisphere, and many struck the Laurentide ice sheet, a vast dome of ice covering most of Canada and parts of the northern United States, up to 2 miles thick in places. Imagine comet fragments traveling at tens of kilometers per second, punching through miles of ice. The kinetic energy converting instantly to heat. Massive amounts of ice flash melting. Entire lakes, seas worth of meltwater being created in moments. This sudden, catastrophic release of meltwater is what actually disrupted the Atlantic circulation and caused the climate to crash into the deep freeze. Now consider what this would have meant for the humans living through it. One day, perhaps a day like any other, the sky would have lit up, streaks of fire crossing from horizon to horizon. Then the sound, or perhaps first the silence before the sound, the strange pressure in the ears, and then impacts, the ground shaking, the air itself becoming a weapon as pressure fronts moved through at hurricane speeds. And then the fires, forests igniting spontaneously from the heat pulse, and the darkness that followed. Not the darkness of night, but something worse, a darkness during daytime. The sun reduced to a dim reddish disk behind choking smoke that would not clear for weeks or months. The temperature dropping even as fires still burned in the distance. Game animals fleeing or dying, plants withering without sunlight, and water sources contaminated with ash and debris. The evidence for human population collapse is written in our genes. Population geneticists working backward from modern DNA have calculated that human numbers globally may have dropped during this period to as few as 10,000 individuals. Some estimates go even lower, suggesting perhaps 3,000 to 5,000 people surviving globally. We came terrifyingly close to extinction. The survivors scattered in isolated pockets would have faced a nightmare world. The vast herds of megafauna they had relied on for food were wiped out. Over 70% of large mammal species in North America went extinct at the Younger Dryas boundary. Woolly mammoths, mastodons, saber-toothed cats, giant ground sloths, dire wolves, short-faced bears, ancient horses and camels, all gone. The Clovis culture, the dominant Paleo-Indian culture of North America, vanishes from the archaeological record at the Younger Dryas boundary. The technology disappears. Of the sites that show Clovis occupation and then above the boundary layer show no occupation at all for generations. The whole culture, an entire technological and social complex that had spread across the continent, gone. Now consider what this means for our understanding of flood myths. If 12,800 years ago there really was a global catastrophe involving cosmic impacts that melted ice sheets and caused massive flooding, if this event really did nearly wipe out humanity, then those survivors would have told stories. They would have passed down memories of what happened. They would have warned their children about the destruction that came from the sky, about the floods that followed, about the world that existed before and was swept away. And those stories, passed through hundreds of generations, would inevitably change. The specific mechanisms would be forgotten or misunderstood. A comet impact becomes the anger of the gods. Meltwater floods become divine punishment. But the core narrative, the essential pattern, would survive. There was a world before. It was destroyed by fire and water. A few survived. They rebuilt. This is exactly what we find. Over 500 flood myths from cultures around the world, all telling variations of the same story. And the Younger Dryas was not unique. The Earth has experienced catastrophes of similar or greater magnitude many times, and it will experience them again. Now, this is not speculation. This is the testimony of rock and ice. Approximately 74,000 years ago, Mount Toba in Sumatra exploded with a force equivalent to several thousand nuclear weapons, ejecting 2,800 cubic kilometers of ash and rock into the atmosphere. The volcanic winter that followed may have lasted 6 to 10 years. Genetic studies suggest the human population crashed during this period. Some researchers propose it fell to as few as 3,000 to 10,000 breeding individuals worldwide. Whether the bottleneck was this severe or more modest, the event would have been catastrophic for any existing human cultures. If humans had developed any sophisticated culture before Toba, it would have been obliterated. The few survivors scattered in small bands would have had to rebuild everything from basic survival. Solar events represent another category of threat. In 1859, a solar storm, now called the Carrington event, struck Earth with enough force to set telegraph wires on fire, to produce auroras visible in the tropics. A similar event today would be catastrophic. Our modern civilization depends entirely on electrical infrastructure. Power grids, communications networks, computer systems, GPS satellites, all vulnerable to the electromagnetic pulse of a major solar storm. Estimates suggest a Carrington-scale event today could cause trillions of dollars in damage and take months or years to fully repair. Our own civilization, for all its sophistication, is more fragile than any before it. We depend on electrical grids that span continents, on supply chains that circle the globe, on specialized knowledge distributed across millions of experts, each of whom knows their small piece of an incomprehensibly vast whole. Remove any of these, and the others begin to fail. We have built a civilization of extraordinary capability, but it is a brittle capability. It requires everything to keep working for anything to keep working. A single point of failure, whether cosmic impact or supervolcanic eruption or solar storm or cascading infrastructure collapse, could trigger a cascade that would look very much like the collapses of the past. Your DNA contains a history book older than any tablet, more complete than any king list. Every cell in your body carries roughly 3 billion base pairs of genetic information, a sequence that took billions of years to compose. And hidden within that sequence are signatures of catastrophe, of near extinction, of moments when humanity came so close to ending that we can still read the scars in our chromosomes. Geneticists have developed remarkable tools for reading this deep history, techniques that allow them to peer backward through time by analyzing patterns in modern human DNA. And what they have found should give us pause. We are, genetically speaking, an extraordinarily homogeneous species, far more similar to one another than we should be given how long modern humans have existed and how widely we have spread across the planet. Chimpanzees living in a single forest in Africa show more genetic diversity than all 8 billion humans combined. This should not be the case. If humanity had grown steadily from a large ancestral population over hundreds of thousands of years, we should show far more genetic variation. The fact that we do not suggests something happened. Something that reduced human numbers to a tiny fraction of what they once were. Something that killed so many of us that the survivors, the few who made it through whatever catastrophe struck, became the ancestors of everyone alive today. You are descended from survivors. Everyone you have ever met, everyone who has ever lived in recorded history, everyone whose bones archaeologists have excavated from every corner of every continent, must all of them trace their ancestry back to a small group of people who lived through something terrible, something that killed almost everyone else. The genetic evidence is unmistakable. Somewhere in the deep past, humanity went through what geneticists call a population bottleneck, a period when our numbers crashed to dangerously low levels before slowly recovering. All modern human maternal lineages trace back to a single woman who lived in Africa, a woman geneticists call mitochondrial Eve. This does not mean she was the only woman alive at the time, but it means she is the only woman from that period whose maternal lineage survived unbroken to the present day. All other maternal lines eventually died out, and the family tree of human mitochondrial DNA shows evidence of dramatic pruning events. Moments when most branches were cut off, and only a few survived to continue the lineage. Consider what this means. Everyone alive today, all 8 billion of us, descended from a group small enough to fit in a college auditorium. Every language we speak, every culture we have built, every civilization that has risen and fallen over the past 12,000 years, all of it traces back to this tiny remnant population that somehow survived whatever happened at the Younger Dryas boundary. The genetic evidence aligns remarkably well with the flood myths. Over 500 cultures worldwide preserve stories of a catastrophic flood that killed most of humanity, believing only a handful of survivors to repopulate the Earth. If the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis is correct, then those flood myths may be exactly what they claim to be. Not metaphor, not allegory, but genuine cultural memories of a global catastrophe that nearly ended humanity. Now we arrive at the question that has been waiting beneath everything else we have explored tonight. What will survive us? What will we leave behind for those who come after? What fragments of everything we have built and learned and created will persist through whatever catastrophe eventually sweeps our civilization away, as catastrophes have swept away every civilization before us? Consider what survives 10,000 years. Stone survives. We know this because we can still touch the stones of Göbekli Tepe 11,000 years after unknown hands placed them. Certain ceramics survive. The fired clay tablets of Mesopotamia have outlasted the cities that produced them. Certain metals survive. Gold most reliably because it does not oxidize or corrode. Now consider what does not survive. Paper does not survive. The Library of Alexandria burned, and with it perhaps hundreds of thousands of scrolls. Leather does not survive. Wood does not survive, except in extraordinary circumstances. And here is the bitter irony of our particular moment. We have accumulated more knowledge than any civilization in human history. And we have stored almost all of it in the most fragile medium humans have ever used. Magnetic charges on spinning platters, electrons trapped in silicon, formats that become obsolete within decades, hardware that fails within years, systems that require constant electrical power just to be readable. We call it the digital dark age, and it is already upon us. Files created in the 1980s are becoming unreadable, not because the storage media has physically degraded, but because the software required to interpret them no longer exists. Government records from 30 years ago are becoming inaccessible. Scientific data is being lost. And this is happening in times of stability, when the electrical grid still functions, when the internet still connects us. Imagine what happens when stability fails. Now imagine all of our accumulated digital knowledge simply ceasing to exist. Not destroyed by fire, but simply fading away as the electrons that encoded it return to equilibrium. A Mesopotamian scribe pressing cuneiform into wet clay 4,000 years ago was using a storage medium more permanent than the cloud servers that hold your photographs. The ancients understood something about preservation that we have forgotten. They understood that information worth preserving must be preserved in media that will outlast the civilization that created it. that the message must be independent of any particular technology for reading it. Consider how they did this. The first strategy was stone. Monumental architecture designed not just to impress, but to encode. The Great Pyramid of Giza stands as it has stood for 45 centuries. If you wanted to preserve mathematical and astronomical knowledge for a civilization 10,000 years in your future, a civilization that might not speak your language, might not share your cultural references, how would you do it? You could not write it down because languages change and die, but you could build it. You could construct a monument so massive and so precisely engineered that it would survive virtually any catastrophe. And you could encode your most important knowledge in its dimensions, in its alignments, in the mathematical relationships embedded in its very form. Anyone with mathematics in any era would recognize pi. Anyone with astronomy would recognize stellar alignments. The second strategy was story, oral tradition, knowledge passed from mouth to ear across generations. The Aboriginal Australians have maintained continuous oral traditions for over 40,000 years. Now, their songlines encode not just spiritual meaning, but practical geographic and ecological knowledge. And this knowledge has survived ice ages and sea level changes and climate oscillations. It survived because it was renewed in each generation. Because the stories were not just recited, but lived. Perhaps this is why every ancient civilization encoded its most important knowledge in religious form. Not because they confused science with religion, but because they understood that religion survives where mere data does not. The third strategy was astronomical alignment. This is perhaps the most elegant solution because it requires no cultural continuity whatsoever, no shared language, no ongoing tradition, just the stable mechanics of the solar system and the simple human act of observation. Newgrange in Ireland, built around 5,000 years ago by people we know almost nothing about, it still marks the winter solstice perfectly. Once a year, on the shortest day, sunlight enters through a carefully designed roof box and illuminates the inner chamber. Anyone with eyes can observe this. Anyone in any era can see the light enter the chamber and understand that this structure was designed to mark this day. The knowledge preserved requires no translation. It speaks directly through light and shadow and stone. What are we encoding for the future? What monuments are we building that will last 10,000 years? The Memory of Mankind project in Austria is storing information on ceramic tablets designed to last for 1 million years, buried in salt mines. The Svalbard Global Seed Vault in Norway preserves samples of seeds from food crops worldwide. The Long Now Foundation is building a clock designed to run for 10,000 years. These projects share a common understanding. The understanding that knowledge worth preserving must be preserved in media that will outlast its creators. But even these projects raise a deeper question. What knowledge is worth preserving? What should we encode? What would we want future civilizations to know about us? The Sumerians preserved their king list with its impossible numbers. We can read it 4,000 years later. What will future civilizations find when they dig through our ruins? Server farms full of social media posts? Or will they find something we deliberately left for them? Knowledge preserved in forms that transcend our particular technologies. Let us return now to where we began, to that quiet corner of the museum where the clay prism rests in its climate-controlled case, waiting as it has waited for 4,000 years. The fluorescent lights have dimmed for the evening. The last visitors have shuffled out through the heavy doors. The security guards make their rounds with soft footsteps that echo through empty galleries. And there, in the silence, the tablet remains. Those wedge-shaped marks pressed into mud by hands that have been dust for millennia, yet somehow still speaking, still preserving, still reaching across the vast gulf of time to touch whoever pauses long enough to listen. Think about the scribe who made this object. Perhaps he was young, an apprentice in the temple school at Nippur or Ur, learning the sacred art of writing by copying texts. His teachers had copied from their teachers before them. He sat cross-legged on a reed mat in a courtyard where the light was good, a fresh tablet of wet clay before him, his reed stylus worn smooth by hours of practice. He did not fully understand what he was copying. The numbers made no sense to him. Kings who ruled for 36,000 years. His own grandfather had lived perhaps 50 years. But the text before him, passed down through countless generations of scribes, insisted on these impossible figures. And so he copied faithfully, pressing each wedge into the soft clay with the precision his training demanded. He did not question. He did not edit. He did not decide that surely these numbers must be errors and correct them to something more reasonable. He trusted that those who came before him had preserved something important, something true, something that future generations would need, even if he himself could not decode its meaning. This is the gift the scribe gave us. Not just the information on the tablet, though that is remarkable enough. The gift is the act of faithful transmission itself. The recognition that we are not the final arbiters of what matters. That knowledge can be valuable even when we do not understand it. That our role is not to judge, but to preserve. Not to conclude, but to pass forward. Not to be the destination, but to be a link in a chain stretching backward into unimaginable antiquity and forward into futures we will never see. Every civilization that has preserved anything has understood this truth. The Egyptian scribes copying the pyramid texts, the medieval monks illuminating manuscripts through centuries of darkness, copying Greek and Roman texts they could barely read because someone had decided these words mattered and must survive. The Aboriginal elders teaching songlines to children, the rabbis memorizing Torah, the griots of West Africa memorizing genealogies, the Polynesian navigators memorizing star paths across uncharted oceans. Each of them understood what the Sumerian scribe understood. We are temporary. The knowledge must not be. And here we are, 4,000 years after that scribe pressed his stylus into wet clay, and we are still reading what he wrote. We are still puzzling over those impossible numbers. We are still asking what they mean. The chain of transmission has not broken. Hands have touched clay across millennia. Minds have pondered the same questions. The conversation continues despite the deaths of empires, the burning of libraries, the forgetting of languages. Something persists. Something refuses to be lost. And you are part of it now. You have received what the scribe preserved. The questions he carried forward have reached you, and what you do with them, how you think about them, whether you remember or forget, whether you pass them forward to someone else or let them dissolve into sleep, You are participating in a process older than any living civilization. You are a link in the chain, whether you intended to be or not. Let your breathing slow now. Feel the weight of your body pressing into the mattress. The day is ending, as all days end, as all things end. But the ending is not the whole story. The ending is part of the pattern. And the pattern includes what comes after. The next catastrophe will come. This is not pessimism. This is geology. This is astronomy. This is the simple recognition that the Earth is a dynamic system, that the sun has moods, that space is full of objects on trajectories that occasionally intersect with ours, that ice ages come and go on schedules measured in tens of thousands of years, that volcanoes sleep for millennia and then wake with fury that makes human warfare look like children throwing pebbles. We do not know when. It might be centuries from now. It might be decades. It might be tomorrow, though probably not. The timing is beyond our control. What is not beyond our control is what we preserve, what we encode, what we build to last, what we teach our children, and what we trust them to teach theirs. The scribe at Nippur could not prevent the fall of Sumerian civilization. He could not stop the Akkadians or the Babylonians or the Assyrians or the Persians from conquering his descendants. He could not prevent the climate shifts that silted up canals and turned fertile fields to salt. He could not stop the wheel of history from turning, but he could copy the king list. He could preserve the record. He could press his stylus into clay and trust that someone, someday, would find what he had made and wonder. And here we are, wondering. His gift reached us. The chain held. We are not called to prevent the unprevented. We are called to build boats against floods we may never see, to encode warnings for descendants we will never meet, to think in timescales longer than our own lives, longer than our civilizations perhaps, to think in the rhythms of the earth itself, which breathes on scales we can barely imagine. Inhale, ice age. Exhale, interglacial. Inhale, extinction. Exhale, radiation. The pattern continues whether we participate consciously or not. But perhaps if we participate consciously, if we preserve wisely, if we encode carefully, perhaps we can contribute something. Perhaps the next civilization will find our tablets, our monuments, our warnings, and learn something that helps them avoid our mistakes. Perhaps they will climb slightly higher on the spiral before they too fall. Perhaps they will pass forward slightly more than we passed forward, and the civilization after them will climb higher still. Perhaps, after enough cycles, after enough accumulated wisdom, someone will finally break the pattern entirely. Not us. Almost certainly not us. We are too early in the process, too ignorant of what we do not know, too caught up in the concerns of our own moment to see clearly across the vast spans of time. But perhaps our contribution matters anyway. Perhaps the scribe at Nippur thought the same thing. I do not understand these numbers. I do not know why they matter, but I will copy them faithfully. I will preserve them. I will trust that someone someday will know what I do not know, and I will play my small part in the great chain of transmission that connects all who have ever lived to all who ever will. That is enough. That has to be enough. Because we are small, and the pattern is vast, and the time we have is brief, and the night is coming. But in the night, there is rest. In the night, there is peace. In the night, The questions can settle, the worries can dissolve. The endless churning of the mind can slow and stop and give way to something deeper. The stars are wheeling overhead right now, though you cannot see them. The same stars that the Sumerian astronomers mapped with impossible precision, tracking Venus across decades, predicting eclipses centuries in advance, encoding their knowledge in tablets that we are still learning to read. Those stars do not care about the rise and fall of civilizations. They have watched countless worlds spin beneath them. They have seen ice ages come and go, oceans rise and fall, continents drift across the face of the earth like clouds across the sky. To them, we are brief. To them, everything human is brief. A flicker in the long dark, a spark that flares and fades and is gone. But the spark was real while it lasted. The light was genuine, even if it did not endure. And perhaps, in the vast accounting of the cosmos, that is what matters. Not that we lasted forever. Nothing lasts forever. But that we were here at all. That we loved and wondered and built and dreamed. That we pressed our marks into clay and hoped someone would read them. That we looked up at the stars and asked questions we could not answer. That we participated briefly in the great mystery of existence. The museum is dark now, and the tablets wait in their cases. The climate control hums softly, maintaining the precise temperature and humidity that will preserve these fragments for another 1,000 years, another 10,000. Somewhere in the building, a clock ticks. Outside, the city goes on with its noise and light, its endless motion. But here in the galleries, everything is still. The Sumerian king list rests in its case, the same clay that a scribe touched 4,000 years ago. The same marks that he pressed with his stylus. The same questions that have no final answers. It will wait for the next visitor who pauses, who reads, who wonders. It has waited 4,000 years. It can wait a few more hours until morning. And you can rest now. The questions will still be here when you wake. The mystery will still be intact. The pattern will still be turning. The cycles still cycling. The vast machinery of deep time grinding on as it always has and always will. You do not need to understand it all tonight. You do not need to resolve anything. You only need to rest, to let your breathing deepen, to let your thoughts dissolve, to let sleep come as civilizations come, gradually and then all at once, rising from nothing and returning to nothing, but leaving something behind. Seeds, fragments, marks in clay, stories passed from mouth to ear across countless generations. The chain of transmission that connects the first human who looked up at the sky and wondered to the last human who ever will. You are a link in that chain. You have received what others preserved. You will pass forward what you can, and then you will rest as they rested, as all things rest eventually, in the deep time that holds everything, in the silence that waits beneath all noise, in the peace that exists when the struggle finally stops. Sleep well. Dream of clay tablets and floodwaters. Dream of civilizations rising from ashes and teachers emerging from the sea with knowledge we have forgotten. Dream of stars wheeling overhead in patterns that ancient astronomers mapped and future astronomers will map again. Dream of the chain of transmission stretching backward and forward into darkness, each link briefly illuminated, each link holding, each link passing something precious to the next. The story continues without us tonight. It will be here when we wake. The scribe at Nippur is still pressing his stylus into clay. The flood is still rising and receding. The survivors are still rebuilding. The teachers are still arriving with gifts of knowledge. The cycle is still turning. The pattern is still holding. And we rest at last in the deep time that holds us all. Good night.